But even wider than that, if we take a look at the whole context, we're basically in what people have called the Sermon on the Mount,
Hmm.
which is really talking, Jesus is talking to people that would not have been the authority figures in their society or even the favored majority in their societies. So he's giving them hope in some ways. So what he's saying is so countercultural in many
Hmm.
ways, so anti-empire, so really trying to lift up people who don't have a whole lot of reason for hope in some ways. That's what he's doing. He's talking about the little people, the nobody, saying, you are somebody. In fact, the whole kingdom of heaven is made for people like you and is
Hmm.
given to people like you. And then to come to this verse and kind of say, well, but now we're going to go very narrow instead of widen and open and make the kingdom of heaven accessible to everyone, not just the religious elite or those who are in positions of authority.
Hmm.
It's very countercultural. So to take this verse and put it back into, oh, now we're going to police how you do things, it doesn't make sense.
All right, hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with a brand new guest. Her name is Martha Elias Downey. She wrote an amazing book called Go Wide, Reimagining the Landscape of Theology. And so, Martha, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So before we get into the book, maybe take a little bit to tell us about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? Tell us about a day in the life of Martha Downey.
Well, first of all, my name is Martha Elias Downey, but if you know me at all, you usually call me Matt. So
Mhm.
feel free to call me Matt, which can be confusing for people who see one name on a book or in publishing, and then in person I go by something else. But there's precedent. Other authors do this, so no worries.
Awesome.
I live in Montreal, which is the traditional land of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, and they are our neighbors, and we like to live in harmony with other peoples. And it's a very multinational, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-food
Mm.
place to live. So it's wonderful and challenging in all these ways. Typical life in the day, what I do, it's different every day, but basically what I do is I work in educational and learning spaces. So
Mm.
whatever that might look like, I do contract work, teaching and doing workshops. This Friday, I'm actually doing a marketing and theology workshop. Yeah, so anywhere, I just came back from a conference presenting a paper there. So anywhere people want to talk about how we think about God and what these notions of God, how they impact how we engage with the world and with each other, I'm there. I'm there for it.
All right, so back up to you talked about the different types of food that are in your area. I'm hungry. So tell me what are some of these dishes that you're talking about?
Well, we have great Indian food, we have
Mm.
great Asian food, we have Mexican food, we have poke, it's popular everywhere. We have a lot of traditional pubs,
Mm.
really sushi everywhere, and then high-end steak houses. Like honestly, just name a genre and
And
you'll
it's
find
there.
it's there.
That's awesome. Yeah, I live in a place in the South and outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, and we have like a couple places. But I grew up in New Jersey and like right outside of New York City, so we had tons of different types of food places. So I miss that life because I don't get that as much here.
Yeah, well, we're kind of like the New York of the North, I like to
Yeah,
think, in some ways. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. All right, so your book, Go Wide, is a really interesting concept for me, and I imagine because of our listeners, because I grew up in this world where I was handed a very, very narrow theology, right? Like a very narrow understanding of God, very narrow understanding of the Bible, very narrow faith. You know, God is to be understood in one way, the cross in one way, the Bible in one way, the stories of the Bible in one particular way. Even in like our homiletics classes in seminary, it was always about finding the meaning of the text, like, you know, the one meaning. And the verse that was always used to kind of back that up was, of course, from Matthew 7, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure, where Jesus has to enter through this narrow gate because it's this small gate and ultimately this narrow road that leads to life, whereas the wider one leads to destruction. But your book I love it because it kind of turns that whole idea of narrowness on its head. And it wonders if perhaps there is this different, bigger, wider, more inclusive, whatever word we want to use, way to think about God. And I think at the foundation of your book, especially early on, you talk a lot about your story. And so I was curious to hear a little bit more about it because any good book comes from a deep place. And obviously, this book came from a very deep place. I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your experience on the quote narrow theological road and kind of what brought you to this place of imagining something wider and bigger and what that looks like in your everyday life and doing the things that you do now.
Yeah, for sure. And I resonate with so many aspects of your story. And I think I was just came back from a conference where Willie James Jennings was speaking, and he says, my life's work comes out of all the contradictions that I face. And I went, yes.
Mm, yeah.
And I think that is where my work, and this just contains so much of what I've been thinking about and processing for many, many years. And I think, oh, it's an answer to all answer. It's a bit of an overstatement, perhaps, but it's a way of addressing so many of the contradictions that I have
Yeah.
been facing in my life. So I start the book by talking a bit about my childhood, where I grew up on the Canadian prairies, and like the horizon is endless. You can see for miles and miles and miles and miles in every direction,
Mm,
and it's wonderful and beautiful. And I think I love that wide open spaciousness. And then as I grew up, more it seemed like more and more my life became more and more restricted. As you say, there's because I grew up in the Mennonite church. So there's
mhm,
one way to think about God, and we have found the best way, and there's one way to salvation, and then there's one way to heaven, and there's these all these rules and regulations.
yeah.
And actually, as I hit puberty as a woman, new rules and regulations were put on me because, the body is very dangerous if you're a woman.
Yeah.
So all these other things are added onto it. So as I progressed in life, I think my life just felt like it was getting narrower and narrower and narrower and more restricted.
Mm,
As a child, I had this immense like a wonder and joy at the freedom of living in this wide open landscape. And
mm,
I think as I just went through life and was involved in church leadership for decades, it was always there were just so many restrictions to how we could think, who we were supposed to be,
yeah.
who we were supposed to be with.
Yeah.
And I know that when we moved to Montreal, I decided to go back to school. So I went to graduate school in theology, and I remember sitting in one of my classes, and the professor just was an exegesis class, an Old Testament Hebrew professor, and she said, "Well, we all know that Adam and Eve are not literal people," and then she just went on with her lecture, and my whole mind was going, "What just happened? Does everybody
Right.
know something that I
Back it
don't
up. What'd you
know?"
say?
I look around the classroom and I'm going, everyone else is very calm. What don't I know that they all
Right.
know? And then it's like, it didn't really freak me out as much as go, oh my goodness, suddenly I'm free to explore.
Yeah.
I'm free to really ask questions and just consider so many things that I was kind of, well, even if it wasn't really stated, it was kind of formed in me in some way that you don't ask questions about certain things. And
Yep.
here, everyone was supposed to ask questions. You were supposed to explore. This is
Yep.
what gets rewarded,
Yep.
and imagine and come up with new ways of thinking about things and making connections. And I went, I am so alive in this learning space. I
Mm,
think I have found that it brought me back to the wide open landscape. I went, this is what I've been missing in
yeah.
this very, very small, narrow way
Mm.
that really has been evangelicalism in so much of my life.
Yeah, that's really good. I resonate with a lot of that, specifically when you talk about sitting in that class and hearing the professor say that we all know Adam and Eve isn't they weren't real. And I remember I had a seminary class. I've talked about this on the show before, and I actually had the professor from this class come on the podcast to talk about this one thing. But it was a hermeneutics class, so we're talking about how to take apart the Bible and how to exegete passages and things like that. And he did this thing where he broke the class up into like let's say 10 different groups. We were in teams of like two or three. He gave us all the same passage. And he said, your group over there is Baptist, and you guys are a bunch of Calvinists. You guys are a bunch of complete heretics doing whatever you're doing. your group is atheists. You guys are atheists over there. And we had to actually come up with this talk or this sermon where we would preach this passage and what kind of ideas we would bring out of it based upon that context we were coming from. And it blew my mind because I was always taught like there's one way to understand every passage, there's one meaning to every passage. And here are these other people coming up with these legitimate interpretations of this passage based upon their perspective. And it completely blew my mind because that was not at all from the place where I came from growing up. And I just had this like aha moment in that class that really I think propelled me to this place where I am today and having these what if questions. What if there are ways to think about all of these things that are much different than these narrow ways that we were handed? So I resonate with that.
Yeah, and I think one of the impetuses for me was just living in a multicultural kind of setting,
Yeah,
moving very much a monoculture where a tight-knit Mennonite community, and
sure.
then moving quite a bit and then ending up in Montreal where you go, not only are there many different cultures and languages and ways of being around me, but I'm
Yeah,
actually a minority in many ways.
yeah,
So not everything accommodates to me. I have to accommodate to what is happening. And that has been such a humbling and really, really good experience for me to not assume that that the way that I know how to do things is the way things should be done.
yeah, yeah. I think I didn't really realize too, and you said it before, and I wrote about this in the book as well, that as a woman, the narrowness only increased for you as you grew and as you like you said you hit puberty. And I didn't really that was an aha moment for me because I was thinking like men don't have that problem. I mean, I experienced my own narrowness, of course, growing up and things like that, things got narrower. But thinking back on my experiences like in private Christian school, especially like junior high, high school, I was thinking about like girls as they were hitting puberty. Like I remember the principal going around and measuring their skirt, their knee to make sure it wasn't too high above the knee. That wasn't something they had to experience as a 6-year old or a 7-year old. That was something they experienced once they got into junior high and high school. But that's an example of that narrowness kind of closing in on them. So I never thought of that. That brought a whole lot of different things to my mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's as you're saying that, I'm thinking it's like there's some kind of gaze that you're not aware of
Yes.
that
Yeah.
that is on you, like God's gaze is always on you, or the authoritarian gaze is always on you.
Yeah.
And whereas before, as a small child, a girl, I could run around free outside, didn't matter what I was wearing. And
Yep.
suddenly this gaze came on me, and everything that I wore, how I presented myself, it
Yep.
was all very much scrutinized, and I had
Yeah.
to do certain things in order to be the good girl.
That's right. That's right. So if we're going to imagine this wider way of thinking, if it's we're going to say that it's not narrow, doesn't need to be as narrow as what we've been given, what do we do with that verse in Matthew 7? I think it's 13 and 14. And I'm going to read it for our listeners just in case they're not super familiar with it. But Jesus is talking about this narrow gate, wide gate. He says, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few will find it. So for me, like imagine, obviously, it's probably the same for you growing up. The idea was that this narrow faith I was handed with this narrow way of thinking about God and the Bible and the cross, this narrowness, straightforwardness, black and white thinking, like this is the road that's going to lead me to life. Anything at all that's even a little bit wider is going to lead me to destruction, which of course must be hell. That's what that word was always interpreted as. But on the surface, like if we lift that verse out of its context, that explanation makes perfect sense, right? Like we can certainly read that in there. But help us understand, like for those of us who are raised with that interpretation, if we were to reframe this in light of this conversation of a wider road, which is a good thing, what do we do with these words?
Oh, well, we just ignore them. No, we don't.
Throw them
Um,
out.
yeah. Well, a couple of things. I actually write a chapter on this in the book, is
Yep.
as an introduction to kind of deal with that so-called obstacle.
Mhm.
But even wider than that, if we take a look at the whole context, we're basically in what we people have called the Sermon on the Mount,
Mhm.
which is really talking, Jesus is talking to people, that would not have been the authority figures in their society or even the favored majority in their societies. So he's giving them hope in some ways. So what he's saying is so countercultural in many
Mm,
ways, so anti-empire, so really trying to lift up people who don't have a whole lot of reason for hope in some ways. That's what he's doing. He's talking about the little people, the nobody, saying, you are somebody. In fact, the whole kingdom of heaven is made for people like you and is
mm,
given to people like you. And then to come to this verse and kind of say, well, but now we're going to go very narrow instead of widen and open and make the kingdom of heaven accessible to everyone, not just the religious elite or those who are in positions of authority.
mm,
It's very countercultural. So to take this verse and put it back into, oh, now we're going to police how you do things, it doesn't make sense. So I think
mm,
that's the first thing. We have to look at it in the context. And the second thing is, I like to look at this uh, as something that deals with transition. So gates are transition points where you're moving from one space to a next, or a doorway. And so when we take a look at the act, what it's actually saying is narrow is the gate. And I'm going, yeah, pretty much all gates are narrow because
mm,
it's a transition point from one to the next. But then it opens up into a wide place or a new place or something different. So gates to a city, small access point, opens up into a city. Gates, if we're talking about shepherds and sheep, small gate to get into a huge pasture where you can just graze to your heart's content and be protected as
mm,
well. So, and the other metaphor I use is that of a birth canal, which we have all come through um, in some way or another. So, this narrow, narrow place of constriction that leads to life.
mm,
We all have this place of feeling, and I've had this several times in my life where I feel so constricted and it feels like tight and very uncomfortable. And I've learned to kind of recognize that as, oh, that means there's some transition probably coming. And don't worry, things will open up. Just as this is kind of the push to get you into that new, wider place. So
yeah.
that's kind of how I've interpreted. And my question when I'm reading the Bible and I come across things that seem very constrictive or very like they're policing me in some way, I go, what is a way to read this so that I find life in it?
Mm,
And that's life for a lot of people, not just me, but life for those who really are looking for it. And that's kind of my one of my guiding principles in interpretation is, how can I read this in a way that gives life to people? Because I think that's what's Jesus' intent always. How
yeah.
can I give life and hope to people, not give them more rules and more restrictions and make their life even narrower than it already is?
Yeah. What do you say to the person who hears that and the Christian soldier in their head that we all grew up with is kind of saying, well, she's just making the Bible say what she wants it to say. Like, how would you respond to that type of criticism if someone were to throw that at you after hearing what you just said?
Well, I think we all do that in some way. I mean, that's the nature of interpretation is,
Certainly, I don't do that.
well, no, except for the let me just say the white European heritage
Right.
men who have totally objective ways of looking at things, for sure. But I think I might question that word want, but I'd say yes, we all interpret it through our own experience. That's the only way we can,
Yeah.
and which is why we want to actually read the scriptures and the text in community, because
Yeah.
everyone's bringing their own experience,
Yeah.
and you just get a richer sense of what it could mean for people, to bring them life, to bring them hope, to bring them some sense of belonging, and a way of doing and being better in this world.
Yeah.
So
That's one of
yeah,
that. Yeah, I think
yeah.
that's like the biggest takeaway for me from that class I was telling you about was that seeing these different perspectives, we all bring our perspective to the text. I think that was the biggest lesson to kind of come away with is that we all bring our stuff to the text. And when we do that, we can come away with a very different interpretation or understanding of it. And I think Richard Rohr is the one who uses the illustration of a diamond, where he says that like every time you turn the scriptures, like turning a diamond, where the reflection is going to be completely different, depending on what type of light from your circumstances is hitting the diamond, it's going to appear differently on the wall every single time. And I think that's such a beautiful point, that you brought out.
Yeah, and it's interesting that nowadays, which it's very kind of modern, recent uh, way to look at the scriptures is to say there's only one way and this is the way and we figured it out and it's totally objective how we made that decision.
Right.
That's very, very recent because you go back to Jewish tradition and it's always about multiple interpretations,
Always.
being able to pull out a lot of different things and let all those different interpretations stand together, even if they're conflicting, and say, yeah, they let them all stand together in tension. We don't have
Yeah.
a problem with that. The
Yeah.
multiplicity of it, the multifacetedness of it. I think we miss that beauty if we just knock all those other things off and say only one way to read this.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that passage. I wrote about the narrow road on my blog. I don't remember. It was maybe like a year ago, but I was thinking about it in terms of I was kind of like flipping it on its head because like I was always taught that the narrow road is, the narrow gate, and the road is all about, you got to believe the right things, and it's all about, if you don't believe the right things, you're going to go to hell. It's all about, believing the things about like the rapture and about like all these different pieces of theology that you have to align with. It's really hard to do that because it's really hard things you have to believe, but it's what's going to ultimately lead you to life. I thought to myself, well, what if the narrow road is actually like the road of like love? What if it's about grace and forgiveness and about these things? Because to me, that's the hard stuff to live. It's easy to hate somebody. It's easy to judge somebody. That gate's huge. I can walk through that gate, all day long. And everybody wants to walk through that gate, but it's that other gate that's smaller, that's much more difficult. So what if it's that gate leads to life, because those are the really hard things to do in life, but that's the path of the Christ, whereas the wider road that leads to destruction. I mean, look at all the things going on in the world today with Israel and Palestine. When we walk through the gate that's all about war and judgment and hatred and all these different things and exclusion, that leads to destruction. That leads right down the path of destruction, whereas the other gate leads to something much more different. So that's kind of how I've been exploring that verse in my own time.
Yeah, that's really good. And that's something that I think is important to note in that passage as well, is this ease versus the difficulty. And what
Yeah.
is the more difficult thing? It is the way of love. It is the
Yeah.
way of peacemaking.
That's right. That's right. All right. Chapter 6 of the book, you have an interesting thought that you kind of open up with. And I wanted to read it for our listeners, if that's okay with you, and ask you to respond to it a little bit. I typed it out over here somewhere. Here it is. Okay. So the first step, you say, in embracing a theology, which is broader, wider, and more spacious, is to recognize where our theology has been based more on cultural, social, economic constructs than on divine self revelation, especially in the person of Jesus. So I think that that's a huge statement. There's like so many things that we could pack that are packed into that statement that we could unpack together. But like if we were to think of modern theology, like let's talk about like evangelicalism, since it's so prominent in the U.S. Like what specific pieces of theology or doctrine or whatever would you say are grounded in cultural, social, and economic structures or constructs that you mentioned? Like what are some examples of what that might look like in theology that many of us would be familiar with?
Yeah, and I'll probably make it a little broader than theology because
Hmm.
theology is situated, at least in our Western kind of world, is situated within these constructs that we live in. So patriarchy, which is one of the things, so it's the assumption that God is male, that God is at the top of the household and rules everyone else, and we have a hierarchy where, there's lesser people in there as well. And I think that's just a given in so much of theology and how we live as
Hmm.
well, that it permeates us and we don't even know. Like for myself, I would say it took me so long to realize that I am living in a patriarchal world that is not built for me to flourish.
Hmm.
Because I'm in it, I don't see it, and I'm still discovering how that is affecting me in not so good ways.
Yep.
So it's hard to see when you're inside it. So patriarchy is one of the things that I think is just unspoken, and even the fact that in studying theology, it was a given that you have to study all the male European classics, so to speak, if you're going to know anything about theology. That's
Yep.
just the assumption. So
Mm,
there's only one type of voice that's allowed to speak to you about
mm,
theology.
mm.
So that's just one of them. Capitalism, can we say that? Uh, and this idea of private ownership
Mhm.
and this idea of owning not only things, but people, and that if it's yours, it's no one else's. and that you can trade and have transactions. And I think so much of our theology, it can be about ownership and transaction, and how we see God as a God who owns many things, owns us even. And this is just not a healthy concept when we're talking about how we deal with creation or with each other.
Yeah.
This privacy and the idea of ownership, meaning you are, again, you, yeah, that something is an object for you to do with as you please,
Yeah.
which kind of how I was kind of taught God does that. God does
Mhm.
with us as God pleases because God owns us in
Yeah.
some way.
I'm a
Yeah, that's not,
tool of the Lord, right?
yeah, I'm used, that,
I'm used by
God is using us.
yeah.
There are some trigger words that I have,
Same.
that every time it's like, no, no, like you'd say that in any other relationship, it would be a huge red flag. But when we're
Yep.
talking about God, no, it's totally fine.
Yep.
So anyway, yeah, this idea of that, conservatism, which
Hmm.
I is valuable in some ways, that you want to conserve things that are important and that you want to carry forward through different generations. But this idea that we are trying to preserve the status quo and not let anything challenge that.
Yeah.
Even people going back to, well, this is in a conversation I had this week with other people saying, well, we can always go back to the creeds. We have the creeds, and that's where everyone agrees on. I'm going, no, you don't assume everyone agrees with the creeds.
Not
Like,
me.
find out a little bit of history about where they come from and what they were used
Sure.
for. And anyway, all that to say, this idea of conserving being um, the main way that we enact our faith is just to always be preserving what was
Hmm.
instead of exploring what is around us now and what could be, because that's how diverse and beautiful and creative this universe is, that
Yeah.
the creator made it. I think we forget about the creative impulse in the creation narratives, and we just assume that everything has been created, that will be created, and we're just here to make sure it keeps going in
Yeah.
only one way. I don't know if I explained that very well, but yeah, this non-creative kind of assumption is really counter creative,
Yeah.
counter creator, counter Genesis in many
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. Where does it, in your estimation, like where does this come from? Because most people would say, well, that's what the Bible says. And that's the way it's always been, and but when you break it down like that, you can see, like, for instance, um, I had somebody on the show, actually the episode released today. Her name is, of the day of this recording, her name is Karen Tate, and she wrote a book called The Normalization of Abuse. And she talks about how, similar to what you had just said about patriarchy, when the churches and society as a whole, elevation of the masculine and the lowering of the feminine and pushing it away has helped normalize abusive situations, whether they're extreme abusive situations or maybe surface level kind of abusive situations. They're still abusive in some way, shape, or form. If somebody is feeling like they're silenced, somebody's feeling like they're not good enough, whatever, that's an abusive atmosphere to live in. But we've accepted it as normal because of the way that, the masculine has been elevated, the feminine has been lowered. So my question is, like, where, like, we come to the idea that we and I did this too. Like, I assumed this stuff was in the Bible. I just assumed it was. That's what I was told, But now that I'm in this place where I'm on my own, I'm out of seminary, I'm away from the ties of those places. I'm free to do this podcast and explore and talk to people like you. Like, I'm realizing that this stuff is not in the Bible. Like, it's not like written law like I was told that it was. So, like, where does all this come from? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would counter that a bit and say it is in the Bible, but it's not endorsed in the Bible.
That's what I'm looking. That's what I'm
Yeah.
meaning. Yeah.
So just because the Bible is full of patriarchy doesn't mean it's saying, and this is how we should do things
Yeah.
forevermore. It's
Yeah.
showing you this is the messy world we live in. Pay attention to the stories of the
Yeah.
victim.
Yeah.
Pay attention to the stories of the people on the bottom. This is what Jesus was always doing. Pay attention to the people on the bottom, the
Yeah.
overlooked, the silenced, those that we assume have very little value. This is the people that Jesus pulled out and said, highlighted them and said, pay attention to these people.
Yeah.
And I think if we learn to read the stories, I'm still learning how to do this. I'm reading through Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, and trying to read it with a new way of seeing, instead of well, this is just the way it is, and that's how we're supposed to do it.
Yeah.
Even, the kings and the prophets, everything they did was correct. Isn't
Yeah.
that isn't that the way it is? They were
Yeah.
God's anointed, so they did everything correctly. When instead we have the story of, well, let's just take David, where it's showing us the whole messy mistakes, missteps, everything that David did, that the nation of Israel did, that all these kings did, that the prophets did, saying, look at this humanness.
Yeah.
And can we, first of all, identify with that? Yeah, in some way. And then can we learn from it? Can we
Yeah.
learn to do things differently? But I think instead, um, by saying that the Bible has, by putting so much authority on the Bible and it's inerrant and everything it says is perfect, we've assumed that all the stories, and they're not directives, they're stories,
Yeah.
the stories tell us how to live when they're telling us stories of what people did that caused incredible harm, and
Yeah.
we're supposed to take something from that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Carolyn Custis James wrote, I forget the name of the book, but she talked about how, like for instance, with patriarchy, we often mistake, and the church has made the mistake of assuming that the backdrop of the text is the law of the text. And like she talks about how a lot of the stories that take place in the Bible were written against the backdrop of patriarchy. That's just the way that it was. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily what the Bible is teaching as directive, as you said before. And when we misunderstand that, we kind of switch those two things around, it can become very confusing and messy, and we start using the text and making the text say things that doesn't necessarily endorse for our modern times.
Yeah, exactly. And she's written
Yeah.
a really very brilliant book, I think, on Ruth, the book of Ruth,
Yep.
which patriarchy is like just blown apart and smashed. Like in the first chapter, they just kill all the male characters,
Yep.
and all that's left is women, and they're highlighted for the rest of the text. So women and foreigners, these are the ones that save the day. They're the heroes. They're the best example of the loving kindness and compassion of God. And at the end of the book, it's so ironic and sad when we have the genealogy, Boaz is mentioned and Ruth is not. So
Mm,
patriarchy just went, thanks, Ruth, thanks so much, and we're back to normal,
yeah.
back to normal programming.
Yeah.
Patriarchy wins the day. So it's just,
Yeah.
that's a brilliant story. And if we don't recognize some of the irony and disruption in all of that, we're missing something really cool.
Yeah. You lose all that when you look at it as this is just a historical story of somebody named Ruth, and this is what happened to them. Like when you miss those elements that someone brilliantly wrote into the story, when you insist it has to be historical like that, like Adam and Eve, same kind of thing. Like you said before, when you insist it was two people who really lived, everybody came from them, you miss the brilliant elements of the story that you'd be able to see if you would just if we would open up our minds to the idea that this is a narrative that somebody wrote to make a whole bunch of points.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So what does it look like then? We talk about these ideas being grounded in culture, society. The second part of that quote about grounding in the person of Jesus, like what does it look like then to take these ideas and shift our focus from culture and society into the person of Jesus? How does our theology or whatever words we want to use to describe it change?
I think that's an ongoing question for
Mm,
me, a process for me of learning. So if we were going to take the ones I mentioned before, patriarchy, what does it look like to live in an unpatriarched world for
yeah.
me?
Yeah.
And I think, well, it's more about so not highlighting, but just bringing the feminine attributes kind of up to par and present as much as we have, like what we would call male kind of ways of being. And so I think really emphasizing nurturing and serving and tenderness and being emotionally literate
Mm,
and vibrant and embracing each other instead of this need to dominate and win and be objective and be strong warriors, like that
mm,
warrior image that we have, especially in the US, not so much in Canada, but this warrior image, like being in the military, is like the height of service
yeah.
for your country. And I think being a warrior is the best you can be. How about being a mother? You give birth to new life. Like,
Yeah.
why is that seen as the height of what you can do in service for your community and for the world? Then,
Yeah.
anyway, just heightening some of those, what we have classified as more feminine traits,
Mm,
as ways of really um, being a whole, being more whole human beings and bringing something to the world that helps everyone around you flourish. And I think Jesus, and maybe I'm imagining here a bit, but that's fine. We can imagine. But I think Jesus really had a lot of feminine traits, traditionally feminine traits that he exhibited, and that caused a little bit of problem for him, in that he wasn't quite seen as the the strong enough leader,
Yeah.
the perfect male in his society. So I think
Yeah.
he brought a lot of that into the picture.
Mm.
And if we look at capitalism or this idea of private ownership, what about sharing? And we see this in the early church as well. They held everything in common. They weren't trying to amass wealth for themselves. If they had wealth, it was to share with others so that everyone had enough. Everyone should have enough to eat, to have housing, to flourish, to basically to live.
Mm.
And so I think this idea of sharing is important to, I can't, oh yeah, this idea of owning. Like, I mean, this is where we got slavery from, and where
Mhm.
and colonizing as well. I don't know if that falls under capitalism. Probably this idea of ownership. So in Canada, we have this horrible history, and I know in the U.S. they do too. Of we just came in and took over the land and said, well, we now own it. And the indigenous people going, how do you own land? How do you own water? How do you own air? Like, it makes no
Mm.
sense. And
Yeah.
I think we really did a huge misstep in colonizing and having this idea of, well, everything has to be owned by someone, so it might as well be us,
Yeah.
instead of, no, you can't own the world, you can't own creation, you can't own other human beings.
Yeah.
So that's a still being, a process for me of how do you live without this idea of ownership is
Mm.
super challenging.
Mm.
So
So
if anyone
yeah.
can.
Yeah. So what has been like, think about that, like you said, that's been like a struggle, like a struggle, but like it's been you're wrestling with kind of what that looks like. What has been the biggest piece that you personally have had to wrestle with in your own faith development? Someone who grew up in a very narrow world, someone who's now thinking about what it means to, widen the conversation. Like, what piece of, whether you want to call it theology or a piece about the Bible or a piece about your faith, has been the biggest wrestling point for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know if I have a really simple answer. Um, because I don't think there's one big thing. I know there's been
Mm.
some, I can point to something, oh, something changed then, but it's always part of a process, I think, a continuing process of learning to live wider,
Yep.
basically,
Yep.
in many ways. I know, well, one of the things is, and to put it simply, I guess, is I am not the savior of the world.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is not that I'm trying to replace Jesus or anything, but this idea that I am responsible for other people, that I need to fix them. I need to make sure they hear the gospel. Need to make sure that they make a decision. I need to make sure that as a pastoral leader, that they're following God in the right way, and that their family's in line, and that they're doing their devotion. Like, I'm just so responsible to make sure that everyone is doing it right,
Yep.
myself included.
Yep.
And it's this huge burden that I just can't bear. And I think
Mm-hmm.
one morning I would just went, I don't have to fix everyone or anything. Really, that's not my job. And I just let it go. And I felt such a sense of relief. And I went,
Mm.
oh, I can just be with people. I can just really enjoy them and learn from them,
Yep.
and try to help them if they're asking for help, and journey with them in a good way.
Mm.
And I think, oh, that sounds more human actually
Mm.
than always trying to be saving and fixing and managing everyone to make sure that they're doing the right thing, which I was doing because that was done to me. And I thought
Yeah.
that's how you lead, you
Yeah.
manage people. And so that was one of the things that really changed for me, is this idea of responsibility
Mm-hmm.
for making the world right
Yeah.
according to my very narrow lens.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, I would say on that same note, I was just talking about this with somebody the other day, that this season of grief that I've been in after my father passed away in March has really taught me that I'm not responsible for everybody else all the time, and I think for me, like growing up in the church world, being a pastor, kind of like you were just saying, it was always the focus was always on everybody else. Everybody else, make sure everybody else is okay, make sure everybody else is doing the right things, make sure everybody else is happy, whatever word you want to use, being present for everybody else and their problems, but I was never really present for myself in mine. And so I never, experienced really grief before. I never really opened myself up to grief. I just bottled everything up, shoved it away, moved on with my life, that kind of thing. And that was a very narrow way to live in a lot of ways, because it was very focused on other people, and I could ignore that messy stuff inside of me. But now this season that I'm in has really opened me up to a much wider space where I've allowed myself to say, it's okay if so and so, if I can't be present for so and so because I need to be present for me in this moment. That has exploded, the grief inside to allow me to experience a lot of things I've never experienced before. So it's a very different kind of conversation, but at the same time, it's I think it's an example of going from that narrow to that wide in a very real life kind of a situation.
Yeah, exactly. Because what you're talking about is the human experience and
Exactly.
fully experiencing the human experience instead of having all these constraints put on you to say this is the only type of human experience that God is in favor of.
Exactly.
Instead of, well, no, it's the whole human experience
Yeah.
that is actually is what makes us know that we are alive
Yep.
and that we share these experiences with so much of the world. That's a beautiful thing. If it's
That's
and it's
right.
a hard thing too.
That's right. That's right. All right, last question for you. Talk to the person who is um, in a place personally where they're trying to think wider, they're trying to believe wider, they're trying to embrace these wider ideas, but yet they still find themselves in many ways in a very narrow world. Maybe they grew up in that evangelical space like we spoke about before, and maybe their family's still in that place. That can make a lot of things very difficult. Maybe their friends are still in that place. Maybe they're still involved in a church that's in that place, but they're trying to think wider. Everything around them is kind of pushing them in to remain narrow. What is your word of encouragement or advice for that person?
That's a big thing.
Yeah.
That is my context still a little bit because I may be living this life over here in Montreal, but my family back in a Mennonite community in Manitoba is still in many ways at the place where I came from. That
Mm,
has not changed very much at all. And some of these interactions have been painful.
mm,
And so I'm still trying to figure out how to really be a good daughter, a good sister, a good cousin, a good aunt to my family that thinks I'm a little bit too wide, or a little too much, or have not, been faithful in the way that I should have been faithful. So those are difficult relationships to negotiate.
mm.
But when you're trying to go wider, I would say whatever is in front of you, say yes to it
Yeah.
in whatever, however tiny and squeaky that little yes can be. Just say yes to that. For me, it was doing some graduate work and reading texts that were beyond my uh, belief system, so to
Mm,
speak. So from different traditions, read different traditions, experience different things that you're not, maybe we're afraid to try because you think, oh no, we'll go with someone and try that thing that you've thought. Maybe I'll take dancing lessons. I don't know, or
mhm,
whatever it is. Take
sure.
someone with you and try it, and just watch. For me, one of the most important things is watch what happens in your body. Am I feeling an immediate tenseness and a closing off? And just question that, going, why am I closing off? Am I afraid of something? Am
Mm,
I really in danger? No, I'm not in danger. Then why am I closing off?
mm,
Is this just it's a fear of some sort? And just to recognize that and go, okay, and talk your body through it and work through it, because we just have these conditioned responses that we didn't think through these responses. We just do them because we've been
yeah,
told,
yeah.
don't go there, that's scary, that's bad, you'll end up in hell or something.
Mhm,
When those are not, it's a fear to keep us, to control people, fear used to
yeah,
control people,
yeah.
and to put your body, yourself, into spaces where you go, I'm actually safe because I'm with people I know, nothing bad is happening. And to let your body know we are safe, it's okay to explore. One of the breath prayers that I do is The world or God is a huge, wide open space, and I'm free to explore.
Yeah.
Like this idea of we are once again back in the creation stories with all of creation to explore and to enjoy instead of, a very narrow way of being and thinking
Yeah.
and living in our bodies. And our bodies really give us a lot of information if we'll just start paying attention to them.
Yeah. That wide open pasture that you spoke of before, right? It's might be a narrow gate, but the pasture is wide open
That's
to
right.
explore.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, hey, we are just about out of time, but this has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for making time for me and our listeners, and thank you for your work. I think it's really important and really good.
Thanks. I really enjoyed this time.
Yeah, and real quick, where can people go to find you online, connect with you and your work, and read a little bit more?
So I do have a website. It's mattdowney.wordpress.com. So it's MatteDowney. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at Matt Downey. You can find me there.
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Okay, thanks so
All
much,
right.
Ben.